everybody. Welcome to this Department of Social Policy and International Inequalities Institute book launch. Delighted to welcome our online audience and our in-person audience. I'm going to be chairing the event today. I'm Dr. Tania Burchardt from the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion here at LSE, and also a member of the Department of Social Policy. It's terrific to be able to launch this fantastic book, Uncomfortably Off, Why the Top 10% of Earners Should Care About Inequality. And we're particularly privileged to have the two authors here today. I will introduce them properly in a minute, but this is Marcos Gonzalez Hernando and Gerry Mitchell. And they will be introducing the book to you this evening. We also have two respondents, Anoosh Chakelian here and Arun Advani here. Again, I will introduce them more properly when we come to their section of the proceedings in a little bit. The book, I think, is particularly important because, in my view, both academic and applied social policy has focused perhaps too much on disadvantage and the people who suffer the consequences of inequality, and not enough on those who benefit from inequality and who may indeed be at least partly responsible for generating it. So this book, I think, is a very welcome correction to that overemphasis on the bottom of the distribution and on disadvantage. So I'm very glad that we have the opportunity to discuss it today. If you wish to tweet about the event, the hashtag is LSE Uncomfortably Off. But please do turn your phones onto silent, those of you in the room, for the duration of the event. We are recording the event this evening, and all being well, it will be uploaded as a podcast afterwards as well, just so you know that we are recording. So the format will be that we will hear from each of the authors in just a moment, then the two respondents, then it'll be over to you for question and answer. Those of you who are online, please use the Q&A function to type in your questions, which will then be read out by my colleague Peter here. And those of you in the room, just raise your hand. So get ready with your questions for when we come to that part. Okay, so I'd now like to properly introduce Marcos Gonzalez Hernando, who is an honorary research fellow at the UCL Social Research Institute and an affiliated researcher at the Universidad Diego Portales and the Center for the Study of Conflict and Social Cohesion in Chile, and is one of the two authors as well. Over to you.
Thank you. So, here it is, right? First of all, thanks so much for coming. I wanted to start this presentation with the same anecdote that you may remember a few years back, with which we started the book. You may remember this man from a Question Time episode in the run-up to the 2019 general election. He became quite famous because he simply couldn't believe that £80,000 a year would make him part of the top 5% of income earners. So he was staunchly opposed to this marginal income tax rates hike by a proposed future Labour government. He thought he was closer to the median, which is 50%, which is rarely over £30,000, regardless of the statistical source. Other members of the audience, though, kind of knew. They started muttering back, but you are. But he remained undeterred. He said that every accountant, every lawyer earns more than that. And at the time when this was happening, we were sort of writing up a report on high income earners. And one of the questions that we asked them is, what do you think it fits in the income distribution? And very few of them, if any, knew exactly where they sat. A lot of them said something very similar to him. But he's not alone, nonetheless. You may have seen in the last few weeks or months that there's been some presence of articles in newspapers like the Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, the Times, that say that the people who earn six-figure salaries are complaining that the money doesn't stretch as far as it used to. This is perhaps especially after COVID, the cost of living crisis, the Ukraine-Russia war, and the last administration by Liz Truss premiership. Indeed, after Kwasi Kwarteng's famous U-turn on abolishing the 45p tax rate for earnings above £150,000, there was this famous author and broadcaster, Tony Parsons, who tweeted, "If you think the men and women earning £150,000 a year are the super rich, you need to get out of it more." As I said, around that time, we were working on a report on the top 10% of income earners in 4 countries in Europe. This was before official Brexit. So there were Ireland, Spain, Sweden, and the UK, and they were written in collaboration with these 4 organizations. So the Foundation of European Progressive Studies in Brussels, the Think Tank for Action on Social Change in Ireland, Compass in the UK, Fundación Alternativas in Spain, and Arun in Sweden. The report asked their attitudes towards inequality and redistribution, and to what extent it was possible to convince them to support progressive economic policies. We interviewed 110 people in those 2 countries, plus follow-up interviews in the UK in early 2022, because we thought the pandemic may have affected this population in some ways. At the time, we were an early career academic, myself, son of the upwardly mobile doctors from Chile, who had seen the country become one of the wealthiest in Latin America, but also one of the most unequal. And I had just finished my PhD at Cambridge. I did my doctoral research on UK think tanks, and I had actually interviewed quite a few members of the elite of British policymaking, but I was struggling to actually find permanent employment in academia at the time. And those of you who are looking for employment in academia will know that non-permanent jobs are increasingly precarious. Gerry is the first in the family to go to university. She spent her childhood partly behind the scenes in luxury hotels in London, where her parents worked as managers. After her PhD in social policy here at the LSE, she spent 10 years on a career break, and then she became politically active in the Labour Party in Warwick, where she now lives, which is a conservative safe seat where she ran as a Labour candidate in 2019, the same election that we were mentioning just now. From that brief introduction, I think, of 2 people with fairly different backgrounds, I think we can see that there's much that we share, relatively close to the top 10% in personal and professional settings, but also not quite there. And this book is partly a reflection of that position, I could say. Some people, when we were working on that report and on this book, told us that we should focus on wealth instead. Because Piketty, in particular, that famous argument you may be aware of, we also thought that nonetheless, even also following Piketty, that if we focus on income, we basically might see interesting things happening with this population, in as much as the logic might be different from the top 10% of wealth. Okay, because they might see their income perhaps stretched not as far as it used to, as I said. Also, many asked us why bother with a group that is doing relatively well and unlikely to support redistribution. And we thought that there were at least a few reasons. One is that they are indeed privileged. They have their high standard of living, longest lifespan, expectancy, expected transform institutions, etc. Why bother? But we wanted to understand them. So basically try to, in as much as possible, to try and get into their minds, and this sort of distance, but also proximity will hopefully allow us to do that. But at the same time, we wanted to understand them. We didn't want to be overly sympathetic. That's a line that was very difficult to thread, that I hope the book manages to. Okay. We didn't want to refuel sort of the kind of regressive arguments of the citizens of nowhere, or the new elite that you may have heard of around this time as well. There's quite a few pundits and politicians that made a career out of those kinds of arguments. We didn't want to do that either. So instead, we wanted to do at least 2 things. The first was to invite them to question their own position, whether they are normal, and whether they should use what has worked in their own lives to judge everyone else. In probably one expression, we could say that we wanted to elicit some form of sociological imagination in them. After all, they are very well placed to address systemic change, because they are the professionals and managers that release the institutions that govern our countries. The second reason perhaps is to explore the cracks that may be appearing in the narrative of constant advancement and upward social mobility. Think, for example, the precarization in academia, but also the barrister strikes, which I believe happened last year, and the precarization of other professions. So the top 10% is also very interesting, sort of statistically speaking. One of the reasons why we picked it was precisely because we wanted to open the black box of the top 10%, considering that it includes billionaires and it includes people that may struggle to get a mortgage on around 60,000 pounds a year. One of the things that immediately struck people was the low threshold that you need to be part of this group. And that the distance between the bottom of the top 10% and the bottom of the top 1%, the middle and the top of the top 1% is obviously not in the graph, right? Because obviously it will be literally off the chart. So as I said, it's incredibly diverse, and a lot of statistics also that speak of the top 10% tend to bundle them together, tend to bundle people in the bottom of the top 10%, which in relative terms are not that far from the median compared to those who are just a few points above in the distribution. Another example from the World Equality Database from Piketty and others, the top 10% in Britain grew in its share of total income by 7.6% between 1980 and 2018. So they're doing better than the rest of us. However, the top 1% grew by 6.3%. So that means that the rest of the top 1% had to share a rise in the share of total national income of 1.3%, which you find fascinating. So basically, the top 1% has captured most of the share growth in the share in the last few decades. Now, who are we talking about? According to the HMRC, for 2019-2020, you need to earn about £58,300 of income before tax. Taxable income. By the way, we focus on personal incomes just because it was easier for us to identify than who to interview. We designed the interview sample to reflect the statistical characteristics of this top 10%, which mean that they would basically necessarily probably be skewed towards men, white, middle-aged, southern, and married, even though the majority of people who have those characteristics are not in the top 10%. The majority of the top 10%, around 2/3, for instance, are men, do tend to have those characteristics. They're likely to hold a degree. They're also more likely than the rest to hold a mortgage, which is probably not surprising. They're generally middle-aged, and the range of ages that we interviewed were between 26 and 66. Also, they're mostly professionals and managers. I believe that about 80% of them are, and the rest are associate professionals or in specific technical occupations, such as, for instance, railway drivers or railway operators and pilots, for instance. Okay, and following Piketty, we also use the concept of two ideal types, the Brahmins and the merchants. The Brahmins are basically those who define the position of top 10% in relation to the professional status and the educational credentials, while merchants do so in relation to the position in the private sector. Okay, which creates two ideal types. Obviously, there are ideal types, if you will. There's no like direct, there's no stark distance between the two, but it's useful to think through, I think. And also, we could say that they have small L liberal attitudes to most issues. You find that, for example, in the work of Martin Gillis in the United States, that shows that they tend to be quite liberal on issues such as same-sex marriage, immigration, foreign policy, etc., but less supportive of redistributive policies. Okay, now how they see themselves. They mostly don't feel rich. They never told us they feel rich, but they do feel privileged. Okay, that's quite interesting, actually. We could go on a bit more on that later. And most are upward oriented, which basically, following the work of sociologist Richard Sherman from the US, means that because they're always oriented sort of towards people who are richer than them, they always think of themselves as somewhere in the middle. Okay. According to a British social attitude survey as well, 47% of professionals and managers declare to be working class, which we found quite interesting too. And there are some sections in the book that talk about different understandings of class as well. And they're feeling that work pays less and less, and especially at the pandemic, we saw a certain tendency to hoard and prepare to any eventuality. Some declare difficulties in making ends meet. Back in 2016, I believe, when we did the reports, when we had the data for the report, basically we found that 12% of the top 10% declared that they struggled to get to the end of the month. Probably these days will be even more. And in Ireland, interestingly enough, which is one of the wealthiest countries in nominal terms in Europe, that figure went up to 28%, which we find fascinating. So, for instance, one of the first interviews we had was by William, who said, I feel fairly middle of the road, an average, but objectively, I know this is completely untrue. I know I'm at the top of the income percentile, but I also know I'm miles away from the very rich. Everything I earn goes at the end of the month, whether it's school, holidays, etc. I never feel cash rich. So chapter 3, which is one of my favorites of the book, is called Work is Life. That's it, which is a direct quote from one of the interviews that we asked. We found that work is very often crucial to the self-definition, in particular, hard work, needing to work hard. In some sense, that's actually, in a way, that's sort of, this has sort of egg and chicken problem in relation to their position of privilege, because are they privileged because they work hard, or because they are privileged, they sort of need to work hard to justify themselves? We had a few sort of questions in relation to that, thinking of favor and predestination. They also very much value educational attainment, especially the Brahmins. Those are, after all, the variables that make them distinct as a sociological group. I mean, if you want to, there are a few graphs on that in the book, that the two immediate variables that differentiate them from the rest of the population are educational attainments and whether they are professionals or managers or not. Okay. We also found that they often found overwork to be a status symbol. It signifies that they're important and competent and that they deserve whatever privilege they enjoy. Right? It's a massive form of sort of justification for their own position. But however, this often leaves time to much else. Indeed, few if any volunteer or participate in the local communities. Sometimes the women do so, while the men earn in the traditional nuclear family model. Yet, in a manner that is a bit reminiscent of David Graeber's arguments in his famous book, Bullshit Jobs, many don't think that job has purpose beyond the bottom line. We asked them about what they thought the role of the private sector was in the economy. That's generally what they said, especially the merchants. We had this question: what do you think is the effect of your work on society at large? Which was sometimes interpreted as an accusation. We try to, we definitely try not to, definitely try not to make them feel that, but sometimes that did happen. But nonetheless, we found that fascinating, that you need to work hard, but the actual purpose of your work wasn't necessarily that important. For instance, one interview that particularly struck me was by Susanna, who is a very accomplished woman who works in a C-suite position in a global bank based here in London. And she said the following, after we asked that question: what do you think is the effect of your work on society at large? Not much really, society at large. Well, I suppose you could say that I'm helping to make sure that this bank is efficiently spending. They've got a huge customer base globally, so we're helping deliver them a product, a more affordable price, and the customer service they get along that is better. So I suppose you could say that. But if I compare that to my husband's contribution as a police officer, case, it's way more. Now to Gerry.
Thank you. So we're now going to hear from Gerry Mitchell, the other half of the authorial team. Gerry, as you've heard, is an independent social researcher and a campaigner and a community activist. I first met Gerry when she did her PhD here at LSE some time ago. We're just leaving that as a some time ago kind of description. We're not going to be specific about that. But it's a real pleasure to welcome you back, Gerry, to hear about this book.
Thank you. So high earners don't like what politics has become, and they described it to us as extreme. That word came up a lot. But whether they like it or not, they are more likely to vote and have disproportionate influence on policy. And this is one reason for writing the book. They're also, of course, overrepresented among the Westminster bubble. Our respondents were progressive, as Marcus said, when it came to cultural issues, but less so on economic matters, in which they were to the right of Corbyn and the left of every Tory leader after Cameron. Our research spanned Brexit, the governments of May and Johnson, the pandemic, and the beginning of the post-pandemic recession. High earners felt shortchanged by the behaviour and ideology of both parties. The quality of the opposition is so weak that the system is untenable, one respondent told us. Those high earners who voted Conservative in 2019 tended to be in the top 1%, but believed that they were much lower down the income distribution. They tended to have young children and were concerned at the cost of living. High earners supported public services in principle, but felt they already carried out their duty to pay tax and that increasing taxation wouldn't solve national problems. They can see that income from wealth is not taxed in the same way as from employment, and they wanted that addressed first. Also, don't too fast. They feared the impact of redistribution, was the final point, on the capacity to pass on privileges to their children. And yeah, they are uneasy with current politics and nostalgic. Most of our respondents are nostalgic for the centre ground. Tony tells us everything's far. What's happened to the centre group? It's not just in politics, it's in every area of life. There's nowhere everyone can meet. The age of debate is disappearing. The age where you can persuade people of your opinion has gone. Everyone sets off down a track. I don't know when it happened. They became polarised. As a rule, high income earners are relatively pessimistic about their country's future and quite optimistic about themselves, which signals a tacit distance between how they see their lives and the fate of the rest. However menacing and huge the challenges of climate change, for example, and inequality might be, many are confident they will still do well. Politics happens to others. While high earners don't have well worked out political ideologies, they can see that what they know is common sense politics, centrist liberal consensus that has held sway for several decades, has become increasingly unpopular with large parts of the electorate. But they are as much in thrall as the rest of us to the political and economic status quo. They don't question it. They don't really feel any real need to. High earners can see the link between meritocratic reward for hard work, as Marcus said, and social goods and status starting to break down. As Marcus described, they know that middle class jobs are hollowing out and social mobility is coming to a standstill. They are more aware than ever that catastrophic events could derail their upward trajectories. And this is Amparo in Spain. I know I'm not doing badly. I'm happy. I've recovered my old customers who, after the crisis, are finally doing better. It's not as good as it was before, but I'm doing fine. But I do worry that if at any given moment I will start doing worse, my children depend on me. I'm 52 years old. I know that if I do badly as a businesswoman and I have to close down, I won't be hired by another company. The factors behind their anxieties, sociological and structural, and affect far beyond the top 10%. So in chapter 6 of the book, we reflect on how high earners may react when faced with future shocks. Mobility is one popular strategy, and partly why high earners never think crises will affect them personally. However, as a strategy to avoid crises, it may prove increasingly difficult. Insulation is another. While COVID-19 reminded high earners of the need for potential of the state, they were relatively insulated from its worst effects. Isolation is also common. The top 10% may be floating away in their own socio-economic bubble, but these strategies of mobility, insulation, isolation, all achieve a decline in trust, and of course are ultimately ineffectual, because we know there's a mountain of evidence decades long. We know that inequality doesn't just threaten those in poverty, but it affects the whole of society on a range of social indicators, including our environment, our health, our security. The end point is a world of bunkers without trust and without a functioning public realm. While the top 10% often work for and with the wealthiest, the interests of the top 10% are and will become increasingly quite different. It's in the interest of the top 10% for education to provide genuine opportunities, for housing to be affordable, for their environment to be green, for work to pay well, for society to remain minimally flexible and open to new people and views, for there to be a functioning and transparent state, and for there to be a democracy at all. As inequality increases our concern with status, the top 10%, I think as Marcus said, also accumulate and hoard. Between 1990 and 2013, accounting for 52% of global emissions. And we know that that is unsustainable. One respondent told us that most rich people's time and money is spent maintaining their status. And of course, their children are included in that. However, high earners can see that intergenerational inequalities are becoming accentuated. There was a strong sense that you can't take your position for granted. The threat of automation came up. High earners frequently told us that public services are mismanaged and inefficient compared to private ones. No one referred to the under-resourcing of the NHS, for example, when we compare it to other countries. Finally, collective denial. High earners' narratives often portray the belief that impersonal forces beyond our control create the crisis we are facing. They don't factor in the political and ideological decisions and processes that have created a massive imbalance between employees and those who own companies, and the resultant extreme unequal distribution of income and wealth. What then are some of the barriers to high earners being able to question and respond to the economic common sense of those that govern us? Those are the barriers we cover in chapter 7 of the book. The first is meritocracy. Something we heard in almost every interview was that if only more parents instilled in themselves and their kids the importance of education, there would be more social mobility. Some respondents acknowledged the obstacle created by this myth, such as Maria. 50 years ago, if you worked hard, you could earn enough to get your kids through school and then to university. And then they could potentially break out of the working class and make the middle class. It's only just starting to hit the middle class that it doesn't matter how hard you work. You may not earn enough money to break even, let alone make it out of your social class. And that is key, that change. Belief in the undeserving is another popular myth that prevents high earners having to consider inequality. Here's Roy. I don't think much about inequality in the UK because even the very poor have a bit of welfare. I don't think they're poor enough for me to feel sorry for them. The less well off are less well off because of schooling, broken families, uneducated families, lack of control, blame everything on the teachers. We also heard that state social spending is higher than in other countries, that people in poverty and receiving the most from the state are largely out of work, and that they, high earners, do not benefit as much from the state as those with lower incomes. Other barriers for high earners to develop a wider sense of social solidarity and belonging and a new social contract include seeing their lives and experiences as mostly separate from the rest of society, together with a fear of falling from always looking upwards, as Marcus was saying, at those that earn more, which results in a constant desire for high earners to imitate the consumption patterns of those just above them, and is a critical feature of the dynamic of inequality. By the end of 2018, UK householders have been spending more than they receive for 27 months, with no comparable trend consecutively, no comparable trend since 1987. And the consequences of having little contact with people from other socio-economic groups also means that the world looks meritocratic and more equal than it really is. And Jonathan Midge has done work on that. Robert Putnam and David Graeber, for example, both looked at whether work would become our new community. But they concluded no, as the ties we form there are mostly instrumental and not social. And perhaps the greatest obstacle was an inability for high earners to articulate our interconnectedness in society. As Bella et al. In Habits of the Heart describe it, one's debts to society that bind one to others, whether one wants to accept it or not. As Sir John Hills concluded, describing our contributions to the welfare state, when we pay in more than we get out, we are helping our parents, our children, ourselves at another time, and ourselves as we might have been if life had not turned out quite so well for us. In that sense, we are all, nearly all, in it together. So as a way out some of the dilemmas we've described, we suggest high earners take a slightly different perspective on the state and their expectations of it. And first, we suggest they start to question business as usual. High earners have long accepted the received wisdom of those in power about how the economy works and what the role of the government can be. So why then has the UK been getting richer and most people have not been getting noticeably better off? Why are the majority of those in poverty today in employment? Why are so many precariously self-employed with sick pay that doesn't cover their living or their childcare costs? Why are those childcare costs among the highest in Europe? It is no surprise that living standards are falling, and this has absolutely nothing to do with how hard people work or do not work. High earners know that they will find it increasingly difficult to maintain their standard of living through wages alone. Instead of asking why the NHS doesn't perform better compared to other health systems, they could ask, how does it manage to perform quite so well when it's clearly under-resourced? And why do poorer but more equal countries have better health outcomes than the UK? And why do higher average material standards no longer improve well-being as they did in developed countries? So high earners don't acknowledge the extent to which inequality affects them directly, because part of their status derives from how they differentiate themselves from others. However, these strategies will decline in value or become increasingly expensive. Not knowing where you stand relative to others, like Rob Barber right at the beginning of the slides, and therefore not understanding and connecting with the economic realities of others, has political impact on our politics. It affects our beliefs on the extent of inequality and the role of redistribution and welfare. High earners gain substantially from state provision, whether directly or indirectly. For example, the doctor who's been trained at public expense, who treats them at a private clinic. The business they run that depends on the state to keep their employees healthy. Maintaining the social fabric, minimising the breakdown of law and order, this particularly benefits in society those with the most to lose. The majority will rely on the welfare state at some point in their lives. The alternatives, as the late Sir John Hills documented, either through private insurance or accumulating enough cash to see our families and ourselves through all eventualities, are hugely expensive and out of reach for most. Therefore, there's an urgent role for those working with high earners to destigmatise public services in their eyes. High earners will also need to start pushing back on the fallacy that the UK spends too much on inefficient public services and that our financial problems stem from excessive state spending. Where has the individualism, market-first, high inequality paradigm that the UK has got stuck in, where has it got us? What are the consequences of debt-fueled consumption, taking money out of the economy? What has been the impact on growth, tax receipts, and the pressure on our welfare systems? What are the long-term consequences of a failure to invest in our social safety net? More deregulation, tax cuts, and further austerity for public services will drive up inequality and do nothing to improve the lives of the majority. So we argue it is time to take a different perspective on the limits that those in power have set the government in the UK. In other countries, we see states becoming more economically proactive. Look at Germany's plans, for example, to become a sustainable, climate neutral and digital economy. Recent events should have made clear by now that it's in everybody's business to expect more from the state. We know that work is becoming less effective at warding off poverty, with the percentage of working age adults in poverty in work at its highest since records began. We know that changes in working life can reduce carbon intensive consumption from the work and spend cycle, and that there is a new narrative, as Mariana Mazzucato so successfully envisaged, in which states have moral resolve and a bold visionary plan to work with stakeholders to bring value and improvement to well-being, health, prosperity and inequality. And nowhere is this needed more than getting serious about net zero. Rather than having the government missing in action, which we do now, we need one that leads on large-scale investment, taking more risks, moving faster, mobilising and upskilling the workforce, promoting the growth of a UK green supply chain. And there is now growing support for taking public services back into public ownership. And finally, tax can be good. Zoe Williams put this beautifully in her book, Get It Together. Anybody can be proud of the NHS. Anybody can use the NHS. You can say you're proud without preening, because your part in it was both vast and minuscule. Nothing could be more material than a school or a hospital. And yet, look at what they give us. Beyond education and health, the knowledge that we're capable of anything, so long as we do it together. But we know that our taxes system, as is, disproportionately focuses on income rather than assets, where true wealth is concentrated, and that the time to tax wealth properly has arrived. High earners want effective tax rates on both individuals and corporations. They want action on removing loopholes, tax avoidance and evasion too. As Martin Sambu put it, while the importance of wealth in our economics and the inequality of that wealth have been going up for decades, the revenue raised from that wealth has not followed suit. Politicians facing pressure on public finances are missing a trick. So in sum, we've been asked quite a few times, what's the call to action in your book? So our call to action for high earners is to stop trying to differentiate yourself from the 90%, get off the hamster wheel, as James Perry, who wrote our foreword, put it, or at least slow it down. And whether that is doing something differently or doing less, or it might be thinking differently. And for those interested in changing the public conversation, it is to develop ways of bringing the top 10% closer to policies that would benefit everybody, because over time, the top 10% will increasingly look like the rest of society anyway. Thank you so much.
Well, I'd like to ask our two respondents to come up and join the panel now.
Next slide.
Next slide.
Yeah. Yes, the next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'd now like to invite Anoosh Chakelian, who is Britain editor of the New Statesman, where she covers policy, politics and social affairs and interviews politicians and other public figures. As many of you will know, she hosts the award-winning New Statesman podcast and co-presents the Westminster Reimagined podcast series with Armando Iannucci. Anoosh, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you for writing this book. It's really useful because weirdly, although people in the top 10%, the way that you define them in the book and in your excellent presentations just now, are sort of undercovered, I think, in sort of political and social affairs reporting, the type of reporting that I do, for example. So it's much more likely for me to go to a food bank to do some reporting on the impact of policy on people's lives than to go to Canary Wharf, like I know you were going and hanging around and speaking to some people there for your research. And, you know, there's lots of very good reasons for that, but also it means that you miss out on an outsized influential group in society. I mean, you make the point in the book that they are more likely to vote, and that our political and media classes are made up of a lot of these people, politicians by definition, because we know their salaries, we know that they are in that top 10%. And so it's really important to know how these people feel, what they're thinking, because politicians are often pitching themselves to these people as well. And of course, they have the means to redistribute so that we do end up having perhaps a fairer society at some point and fixing some of the problems that you brought up in your presentation. So it's very important to know what they're thinking, to speak to them and to cover them like any other group in society, even though, you know, the work that we've done on them, and we've done quite a lot of reporting on this and some exclusive polling as well. And we do get a bit of stick for it from followers on social media, because they ask us, you know, who cares about the plight of these people? But, you know, it tells a very fundamental story about the country and the sort of politics that we're stuck in, and the kind of common sense, small L liberal centrist kind of, the economy is something that happens to us rather than something that's a policy or an ideology kind of way of thinking that you describe so well in the book. So I'm really glad that this book has come along, and it chimes with a lot of the work that we've done. So I'm going to talk a bit about sort of what we've found in our own research, but also politically what some of what you found means. You can see in politics, some politicians are picking up on this kind of the uncomfortably off. It used to be the squeezed middle. I think these people are above the squeezed middle, but I think that's coming back into fashion a bit. You had Nadeem Sahawi talking about people on £45,000 struggling with energy bills. Keir Starmer in his New Year's speech, it's something that I don't think was picked up by that many people. He said the anxiety and shame of not being able to pay bills that only months ago were affordable. So people are on their radar who once felt affluent, who are now feeling a little bit more of a squeeze. So really, I mean, Labour needs to try and appeal to these people more in order to sell policies that would make our economy fairer. To do this, I've got a few ideas. I think Labour needs to stop talking about wasteful state spending. So that's a big theme for them. It's tempting to talk about because of the money lost through the sort of fraud involved in the COVID schemes, the crony contracts, the waste through test and trace and things. Of course, these things are scandalous and they should be scrutinised and they should be transparent, but I don't think Labour should major on them, because it does sort of reiterate this idea that a lot of your respondents had in this book, that they don't really want to pay higher taxes because the state doesn't really spend their money very well. It's inefficient. You know, the NHS is, you know, inefficient. Actually, the NHS is almost too efficient. There's not enough slack in the system, as we've seen very starkly lately. So I would say, you know, that is probably a bit risky, as well as in general talking about the tax burden and talking about taxes if it's something negative. I really loved the end of your your presentation, Gerry, where you had that sort of rallying call to why tax is something that perhaps we should be proud to be paying, and it could almost be a point of patriotism to say, you know, you've built this, you know, you're giving into this image of the country that we like to imagine. And then you move on to the much more complicated topic of taxation, where to pitch. If Labour are going to do the things that they want to do when they come in, they're going to have very little money to play with, so they are going to have to increase taxes somewhere. So where do you pitch an income tax or a wealth tax? You saw the trouble that John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn got into with that guy on Question Time, you know, when they were trying to pitch a sort of tax for higher earners. People just don't see themselves as higher earners, as you found in your book. And even those who know that they're sort of on average wages or below average wages would like to see themselves one day as earning a bit more, and don't like the idea that that would then be taken away from them. So this subject is just fraught with political difficulty. People have contradictory opinions of it. It's really tough. So I can see why Labour are struggling to talk about it. Keir Starmer's dropped his leadership pledge to increase income tax for the top 5% of earners. And they are also avoiding saying anything about raising a wealth tax. So the calls from their party, from both the left and the right, as well as outside of politics, are saying, you know, you should equalise capital gains tax with income tax. That's sort of the most common sense wealth tax that comes up, and I'm sure Arun will talk a little bit more about that in his presentation. I was speaking to Margaret Hodge, who's on the right of the party, a Blairite kind of veteran, about this, and she said she thought that they should do this. But she said, I'll be hit by the front bench for telling you this. They're nervous and reluctant to focus on tax justice. And I've heard actually from sources that when a wealth tax is brought up with Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, she actually says, well, what, and lose the next election, you know. So they're really, really concerned about the perceptions of a wealth tax or a high income tax on sort of public sentiment. There's reasons for this. So the first of all is this so-called shadow budget ahead of the 1992 election. This included tax and national insurance rises on higher earners to pay for child benefit improvements. This has kind of gone down in party law as the reason for that 1992 very crushing, you know, disappointing and surprising election defeat, even though it was much more complicated than that. And then a more recent example is the mansion tax of Ed Miliband's 2015 campaign. That still gives strategists who I see, you know, a pained expression, people who are around then whenever I bring it up. You know, this was symbolic of policies that they thought put people off Labour at that election, you know, even people who didn't live in mansions. So why is this? I mean, a lot of the research that we've been doing into public attitudes on wealth, class and salary reflects what you found in your book. We found that it's very difficult to work out where to pitch a tax without looking anti-aspirational or like you're attacking ordinary people. So on the one hand, you have the public who don't realise the top 10% of earners are actually closer to the median, closer to them, the normal, than they are to the top 1% and the super rich. But then on the other hand, you have the top 10% thinking that they are normal and that they are sort of the ordinary. And so when you're talking about the top 10%, people are hearing different things. People don't know what you mean. And there's, you know, there's a lot of like different self-perceptions that go on as well. So we found that a quarter of Britons paid 100 grand or more identify as working class. And that chimes with what you found from the professionals and managers identifying as working class. 60% of British voters on 80 to 100 grand say they are about average on the income scale. Again, that, you know, backs up what you were saying about your interviewees saying they don't feel rich. Over half of Brits on significantly more than average household income say they are about average for UK households. But there's also sort of more difficult to understand psychology at play here too. So in general, members of the British public are far more likely to underestimate than overestimate their income compared with the average. So no matter their income, wherever they are on the scale, people are far more likely to feel that they have a below average income than above average compared with the general population. Brits are also far more likely to believe their social circle, so this is we describe this as their close friends and family, is better off than worse off than they are, no matter their income. So the majority said that they feel about the same, but actually, you know, more said that they felt worse off than better off than the people around them. So you're always comparing yourself to the people around you, and that comes up in your book where, you know, people are obsessed with chasing social status and not falling behind, keeping up with the Joneses. Even those on very high incomes have a tendency to feel less fortunate than their close friends and family. So 43% of those with a household income of 100 to 120 grand consider their social circle better off than they are, while virtually no one in that group considers it worse off. And also, this isn't to say that they're wrong. They might be hanging around with people who are all richer than them. And of course, a lot of the interviews in the book, people make the point, well, you know, I know that I'm privileged, but I'm not like super rich. You know, I don't have a yacht. I don't, you know, that's the way that we all see ourselves, I think. Wherever we are on the scale, we're always comparing ourselves with that sort of fraction above us, I think. So that makes it very, very difficult to pitch any kind of redistributive tax. So I do have sympathy for Labour, even though it is frustrating for the people who are campaigning for better tax justice. How much more time do I have?
Sort of minus a minute or so.
Okay. So I think in terms of what Labour could do in terms of making more positive arguments to try and bring people on these incomes round to their kind of, you know, a more fair vision of society, I think they should make arguments for universalism. So there was a lot of skepticism about universal services and benefits, and you know, you saw with the energy subsidies everyone got the same, and Labour actually sort of criticised that and said, oh, why are you giving these energy like subsidies to people who have second homes, for example? I don't think they should be making those arguments, because like you made in the point in your presentation, if you contribute to society, then you know you feel more of a societal bond with other people, and you've brought into the system. You're not sort of siphoning yourself off into a bunker like you had in that cartoon. So I think they should make that argument. I also think they should try and talk about the good life. So a lot of your interviewees, and this is, I think, a chink of hope in what you found, felt a bit like they were in the rat race, you know, in the hamster wheel, as you put it. They felt like they were high up at work and they were earning well, but they kind of felt like they didn't have that much control, and they wanted a better work-life balance and had a taste of it maybe during the pandemic. I think Labour should talk a bit more about that. So, you know, at the moment, they only talk about us as being cogs in a machine, sort of about productivity, growth, economic inactivity. You know, the government does it too. They never talk about a nice life or leisure time. And we look at Lula in Brazil's campaign message of one day you will drink beer and have a barbecue again. And Mélenchon in France recently did a speech promising workers time. So time to write novels, to read poetry, or have the luxury of doing nothing at all. So our politicians in this country never seem to make these arguments, but I do actually think that they could resonate with some of the people that you were talking to, and it's something a bit more positive and a bit more human. So yeah, I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Our final speaker today is Arun Advani, who's an Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Warwick and also a visiting Senior Fellow here at the LSE's International Inequalities Institute.
Great. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for inviting me to speak about this kind of fantastic book and to kind of offer a few reflections. So I wanted to start with 3 facts that seem like they're disconnected, and I'll show you why I think they're related and why this book kind of is really relevant to thinking about these. The first, which Marcos picked out really nicely with that graph showing you incomes, is that the top 1% are close to the top 10% are closer to the median than they are to the top 1. So someone in the middle is only about 30,000. Someone in the top 10, just getting to the top 10, is about 60,000. They're closer to that than they are to someone in the top 1%, who's at about 125,000. And someone in the top 1, who's at 120, just into the top 1, 125,000, is still closer to someone at 10% than they are to someone at 0.1, to someone who's earning about 500,000. So there's that sense in which there's always someone much further up. I'll come back to that. Second stat, it's often quoted that the top 1% pay about 1/3 of income tax. It's worth saying income tax is only one of the many taxes we have out there. It's often quoted they pay about 1/3. So they're really important from thinking out a tax perspective. It's worth bearing in mind that the next 9%, that's the rest of the 10% we've got to think about here, pay the next third tax. So about 1/3 of income tax is paid by people outside the top 10, 1/3 is paid by people inside the top 10, but not in the 0.1, in the top 1, and 1/3 is paid by that top 1. Third stat, 1/4 of people who have incomes plus capital gains, which is another form in which you can take your money, who have income plus capital gains of £10 million, paid a tax rate of about 10%. 3 stats. So why are these things connected? So first, as I said, these three, this curve, this amazing graph that we just saw, how extreme it is as wealth goes up, how spread out those incomes are. Part of the reason that it's really hard for people to think about, at whatever level of income they are, to think about the fact that maybe the tax system should take away more from them, because they look at how far they are, going just down by 1% from, if you're at the 1%, you go down to the 2%. That feels like, look how far down I'm going in terms of my income, what I can afford to do with that. When I go up, that's great, but I can already, that's so far away. There's so much more money there. It's so hard for me to get up there. So it's just not quite doing as well at school, not getting my kids to have that extra tutor, not giving that extra experience, makes it that much less likely they'll get into that top place. And so as that top kind of peels away, as the top incomes get further away from those further down, it becomes increasingly important that kind of social mobility gets harder. It gets harder for people to move up. And so going slightly further down is really costly. You're losing out on huge amounts of income for your kids if they go from the top one to just the top two, the top two to the top three. And so that puts that pressure on parents to feel like, oh, I need to keep everything. That beautiful graph, that picture actually that Gerry showed us, I really like that of everyone in this kind of bunker, right? Trying to kind of fight for their own little world. You want to fight for your kids. That's the thing that's natural for a parent. You want to fight for your little bit of space. And as inequality increases, as that gap between me and the people who are just a little bit further up gets further, it becomes that much more costly for me not to make sure my kids at least stay where we are and we don't go further. That's first. Second stat I gave you was this 1%, next 9%, the rest of the distribution, paying a third, a third, a third. So there's two reasons that's important. So one is there's often this kind of complaint about how essential the top 1% are in terms of how much we rely on them for income. So for the tax that we get from them. And it is true, we get a lot of tax from them. Part of that is for exactly that graph you just saw, they have a lot of income. And that's why they pay a lot of tax. It's not an accident. But it's also important because the fact that the next 9% also pay about a third tells us that those people, as much as they might say, look, I don't feel rich, I feel like those people are richer than me, and these people are poorer than me, I'm not feeling like I'm rich yet. You can't get away without those people having to pay more tax if you want all of the things that Gerry and Marcus talked about in terms of having those public services, having that society we want. There is no solution to having that society that involves only thinking about taxation at the very, very extreme top. At the very extreme top, you can get quite a lot of money, and we'll come back to that. But even if you're doing that, if you're thinking about a state that is more capacious, that's covering some of these additional public services that Gerry and Marcus are talking about, you can't rely on that only being at the very top. You will have to be taxing more of the rest of that top 10%. And so it's worth people in that group being aware that if they have those goals, if they want that society, they are going to have to contribute towards that because you can't only get it. There's a lot of money that they also have that they also could be contributing towards the system. Third stat, a quarter of people with income plus capital gains of 10 million paying a tax rate of 10%. So that stat is important because it highlights the fact that it's not just about taxing people more, it's about taxing people better. It's that the current tax system does not work. As Anoosh said, a big reason for that kind of statistic is the fact that capital gains are taxed at a much lower rate than income. So capital gains, the headline tax rate for someone who's earning, who has hundreds of thousands of pounds in capital gains would be 20%. But until a few years ago, you could get under a relief that's been usefully renamed bad relief, you could get up to £10 million at 10%. They've abolished that, they haven't abolished it, they've reduced it to £1 million. But in the meantime, you can get £10 million on investors' relief at 10%. So there's still a relief that lets you get £10 million at 10%. Have we got rationale for that? Is there a well-stated reason? Imagine, you're a civil servant in the Department for Education. You want to say we need more money for schools. You say that it's really important to do this. You have to write out a whole long list of why it's so important to get this money for schools. And you have to go and beg with a little bowl the Treasury to maybe get a few more pennies, a few more crumbs to go and have to all the schools. Is there anything like that scrutiny over these kinds of tax? There's a nice report from the National, a depressing report from the National Audit Office highlighting how little scrutiny there is over these reliefs. How we don't even know what the point of the relief is in the first place. And we certainly aren't measuring whether it's living up to those things. So fixing capital gains tax, making sure that capital gains are taxed more like income. And this is going to be disappointing for some people who are landlords, making landlords pay more tax, because right now, if you are working full-time on minimum wage, you go to work, you pay income tax, you pay national insurance, and then you go home and pay your landlord, who pays income tax on that, but doesn't pay national insurance on that. It's not going to be an argument that Labour are going to have lots of fun going out there and making, because there'll be some landlords who are very annoyed, or people who want to be landlords. But ultimately, if you're going to raise money and you're trying to do it fairly, this is not about taxing people more than somebody else, it's about making sure it's equal. It's currently not an equal system, and that is important to remember. And it was mentioned by Marcus at this point about inheritance and what you want to do in terms of, again, trying to provide for your kids. It's natural that we want to provide for our families, for our children. And in a world in which incomes are more extreme, as they're getting further apart, you feel that much more important, more kind of value in trying to provide for your kids because you realize how important that is. It's so hard to get them into the top job, into the whatever thing it is you want to be able to provide for them. But at the same time, not everyone is lucky enough to be born to parents who have those opportunities, who are able to do those things. And so dealing with the fact that currently inheritance tax is nothing for the first £1 million you have. We know in practice it's about 20% for people who have about £2 million. It's a lot, but it's only 10% by the time we get to £10 million. So there's a government report showing this from 2018. Fixing those kind of loopholes is another part of it. So final thought, having tried to tie those three facts together, is where do we go from here? Anoosh pointed out all of the difficulties in the politics of this, and they are there, and they are very real. But I think the reason that this was then, such a lovely chance for me to come and speak about this is that I think Gerry and Marcus's book is exactly what you need if you want to think about making the case for why the current situation isn't there. I mean, politics is hard, and politics is hard because currently people don't know enough about how the system works, and people don't understand what the issues are. It's perfectly reasonable. You have lots of things to do with your time, and there's no reason you wouldn't know all of these things. I think Gerry and Marcus's book is a really good way of kind of shining a mirror to people, showing them actually what does a situation look like, helping out resonate with them and understanding this is actually, for people who are in that top 10%, yeah, that is actually kind of how I feel. That's what it means for me to feel like that and to make those decisions. If I'm not in favor of a policy that takes it more from me and more from other people like me, then I'm not going to get those public services that I might want. And so you can still decide that. That's a perfectly legitimate place to be. But to understand that those are two sides of the same coin. If people like you are not paying more, then people like you are not going to have access to better public services. So I think this book is a fantastic way to bring those sorts together. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you. Lots to think about there. So it's now time for the questions from the floor here and also from our online audience. Just to remind you, online audience, if you would use the Q&A function and type in your questions, I'll come to you second. I'll collect a few from the room first. In the room here, raise your hand. Some of you are doing already. And if everybody online and in the room could just say your name and your affiliation, which might just be an interested member of the general public, that's fine. But obviously, if you're from LSE or have a connection with LSE, we'd love to know that too. And please keep your questions short. Okay. Anybody in the room? Yes, in the middle there. You just wait for the mic. I was in the middle there in the green jumper.
Hi, thank you all of you first of all for the really interesting contributions. My name is Felix. I just want to ask how you think Labour communicate to the top 10%. If they were going to increase taxes, for example, on them, how do they communicate that message to the top 10%?
Thank you. And then there was another question at the front here.
Yeah, thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm now a broadcast journalist, mainly on the war in Ukraine. My economics teacher way back at school was an LSE graduate. His professor was a former assassin in Sarajevo in 1914. My question is about particularly based on Dr. Advani's points about equalising taxes. And I think there's an element in the room here, of course, that for very many people, including probably, I suspect, the majority, but significant numbers of the 10%, not the 1%, of course, the main capital gain is in the equity in their primary home. Which is, of course, exempt from CGT, and Labour's going to, I think, be very careful. So my question for all of you is, and I'll understand if you don't answer it for obvious reasons, what proportion of your personal wealth and the personal wealth of your household is equity in your home?
Okay, do we have one more question to take in this first batch? Yeah.
name's Patrick. I guess I'm an interested member of the general public. I'm interested in the title of the book because it seems to me what we've talked about is about tax and policies specifically for Labour. And I wonder if your aim is to engage the top 10%, it seems to me, perhaps it's a little unfair, the title should be, you are actually rich and by default you pay more tax. Because if I look at the title of the book and hear what you've talked about, I feel as though that's not quite what the title suggests. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on whether people will pick up this book if they're in that top 10%, when actually it basically seems to be all about telling them they're very wealthy and to pay more tax.
Very much. Okay, so we'll take those first, and then we'll come to the online audience. Gerry, do you want to start, but perhaps in particular about communicating to the Labour Party, or whichever you want to start with?
Yeah. So some of Anoosh's points I think are bang on, that trying to hypothecated taxes, where you make much clearer, for example, in the tax in your tax slip what you're contributing to. That kind of personal link between where your tax is going. I think that connection has been lost, and so I think that could be one option. I think that it's more about reforming the tax system as a whole as well. That's the first message that top 10% were telling us. They could see that it wasn't working. So it's more about addressing all the wealth tax issues. It's reforming the entire system, as Arun was saying, not just increasing top 10% tax. So it's seeing the reform in the whole. And I think looking at other countries also helps at realizing some of the myths that our media has been telling us in particular, and what things could look like, you know, with being paying just a little bit more tax.
Marcus, would you like to talk about defend the title of the book?
Sure. I was thinking, actually, that's a really good question. That the book in many respects is trying to understand sort of the fears, preoccupations, and one of them is tax, because just going back to the first fellow from the question time episode. I mean, one way of thinking about this is that if they raise their taxes more and more, and if they don't feel like their public services are actually delivering, then what's the point of raising the tax in the first place? Because they don't particularly think that they are the users of these public services, because obviously they earn enough to actually not need them, because there's a certain stigma in their view to have to recur to these public services. That's part of the reason why in sort of in their minds, in many ways, they distinguish themselves from those who require access to public services, not thinking of the many ways in which we all depend on them. That's one thing. I just was reminded as well of a meme that I saw recently on Twitter. Basically, like after-tax income in different countries, and that meme in particular, coming from a sort of libertarian account, said that basically because income tax rates are incredibly low in places like Dubai, that's more or less where we should go. And I find that fascinating because in some sense, and that's the point that Gerry made, the top 10% actually benefit from having a relatively robust welfare state, and for there to be a democracy at all, the top 1% doesn't need that. That's I guess that's kind of what we wanted to highlight with this title. The point on equity in your home is something interesting that we sort of try to cover in the book as well. Is sort of we try to be very self-reflective. I mean, you can judge when you read it whether we succeed or not, because we are coming from one perspective, which is Brahmins. We are Brahmins. Yes. The LSE, what I could say, is more or less divided in the merchants who end up going to accounting, etc., and the Brahmins who end up working in academia, NGOs, or government, right? And one of the strategies that we can sort of pursue in our everyday lives is basically transform our income in as much as possible into wealth. That sort of defeats the very idea that we live in a meritocracy in the first place. But it's also kind of unavoidable. I think the ending of the second chapter is precisely about those contradictions. Another one, and that's really interesting, there's several of these contradictions. One of the most important ones, perhaps, in relation to climate change is one of the most, they declare themselves to be the most worried about climate change, but also they're the ones who, to have the largest carbon emissions. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, in terms of, yeah, I mean, in terms of the question about how would Labour communicate
Yeah.
a message about raising more taxes on the 10%. Yeah, I mean, as I laid out in my comments, it is really difficult. I don't think that there is any political world and that they're going to go into the next election promising anything like that. So I suppose the first answer would be they're not going to do that, I don't think, unless, you know, something, you know, massive changes in terms of public sentiment. But if they were going to do that, if they were going to say it before an election, then I do think that appealing to people's sort of fondness for some of those sort of areas like the NHS and less focus on the welfare state, because there was quite a lot of scepticism about benefits in the responses that you got from your interviewees, would be probably the safest way to do it. So you know, the Treasury hate hypothecated taxes because they don't really ever end up, you know, going into one pot. But I have heard some people in the sort of progressive policy world just saying, just say it's hypothecated and then just use it for what you need it for once it comes in. So I suppose if you did say, you know, this is to fund the NHS, then that might be a way of softening the blow a bit, that it would be really difficult. And I think to be able to sell these kind of tax rises, you do need to change the mindset of the people that you're levying the taxes on, which is why I made the points about, you know, stop talking about a tax burden, stop talking about wasteful government spending, you know, try and talk about society in a different way. Basically, don't use these frameworks that are the frameworks ultimately of your opponents. That's probably what I would advise.
Also, so just quickly say, to improve public understanding of the negative consequences to that cartoon.
Yes, yes, exactly. I mean, you know, this idea of private wealth and public squalor, that's kind of the world that we're going into. And I don't think people do like that. And people are more connected to their local communities if they work more from home. So there is a bit of an opportunity there, which is why I talk about the good life. I think that could be a good new message that you're not hearing from either side at the moment.
I suppose pick up on the capital gains in your main home point. I mean, clearly homes, as unfortunate as it is to tell people this because they don't like it, are under taxed. People don't like to be told that their homes are under taxed, but they are. All political parties are burned by the attempts to reform the poll tax to create the poll tax in 1990, and then the stopgap council tax that we introduced at the time, while we figured out what we do, and 30 years later has not changed, and still use those valuations. And I mean, the answer to taxing homes better is not to try to bring them to capital gains tax, which would be hard to do that with main homes. I think it is to have better council tax. The problem with fixing council tax, and I'm always a bit of a pessimist on it, even though I would like it to happen, is that although something that's more like a proportional property tax would be a great idea, and there's a campaign Fair Share out there that's been working very hard on designing a system that would help the transition work, as well as ending up in a good place, having a way in which you would smoothly transition people across this process. So I commend their campaign to you. But despite that, it is a hard process because you're not only trying to reform taxes that annoy some people a lot, you're also trying to deal with all of local government funding at the same time, because council tax funds for local government. And so you're having to deal with how do you have lots of money suddenly in Kensington and Chelsea and lots less money in Redcar, and you're having to make some transfers across those places. And alongside all of that pain and all of that dealing with local government, as central government, you've got no extra actual cash out of it up front, because to start with, you probably end up doing something that's close to revenue neutral, because anything more than that will upset a lot of people, and you might not want to upset much people. Oh, and also, alongside all of these things, you also pretty much lose seats in wherever else has had house price growth. Whoever does it loses those seats. And so that's also not very good, because the pain is concentrated, and so in a first past the post constituency system, you lose a bunch of constituents. So I'm sadly a pessimist on it happening, but I absolutely think it ought to happen. And I think that if it's going to something that has a very smooth transition process to try to help it, isn't it?
But I think in your book, your course, they're quite keen on proportional property tax, aren't they? Have I made that up? I read that elsewhere. Maybe it was just a moment of hope while I
Okay, we're going to take some online questions next, and then I'll come back to the room. So hold on to your questions in the room. Peter, what do we have?
So the first question is from Donna Carmichael, who's a PhD student at the Department of Sociology. Donna said the super rich, the 1%, are increasingly seeming more amenable to paying more tax. wouldn't it generate vastly more tax revenue by going after the 1%, many of whom benefit from tax and state advice, to generate more tax revenue rather than the 10%? And the second question is from Hartley Dean, who's got two questions. One is, how internally consistent was the discourse of your respondents? The second is, how much room is there for optimism that the agenda for change you present could be accommodated?
Okay, so maybe we should go after the top 1% after all. Arun, I guess that's
squarely to me, in fact. As I said, I think a lot of the reforms you want to do to the tax system, the place I would start is not by thinking about raising the tax rate on the kind of overall tax rate on income tax or something like that covers everybody. It's about fixing the specific taxes that are broken. So, for example, fixing capital gains tax, that is equalizing it with the rate of income tax and making a few other adjustments that need to go alongside it. I'm happy to give people a long discourse on if they want. Raises kind of 14 to 16 billion pounds. So that's thinking of that as raising kind of 2p on the basic rate of income tax and on the higher rate. So it's serious money. You can raise about no, I'm gonna get the numbers wrong. About almost as much as raising 1 penny on the basic rate of income tax by closing the loopholes on capital on inheritance tax. So fixing those kinds of taxes, extending national insurance contributions so that landlords are paying, which they currently don't, and the people who have money on dividends are paying low. The rate you need for dividends is lower because there's corporation tax. But fixing those kinds of things raises as much as 1.5p on the basic rate of income. There's quite a lot of money that can be made just by fixing those taxes. And so I think the places to start are for those things. And the arguments around those are pretty straightforward in that the system currently taxes work much more heavily than wealth. It's hard for any party, left or right, to stand up and say, we think that work should, not pay compared to other sources of income. It's a pretty hard argument to have. So in that sense, it should be pretty straightforward to do that. And no one is currently standing up and making an argument because clearly the people who get their income from wealth or are going to pay more in inheritance tax are going to shout very loudly. And you're going to always get the specific, here's my one sob story that I can find of like someone who is the really deserving person who's going to be hit by this. And we need to, and I mean, it's not to say that the other people are not deserving, but the point is, if we're going to raise money, we're going to have to raise money from somewhere. And currently the status quo is not a good system. So the problem is always that there's a status quo bias where wherever we are is where we are. And someone is going to lose when you move from here. And so those people will shout loudly, and that's what keeps us where we are. But I think fixing those things is certainly a place to start. But depending, I haven't kind of tried to cost up what the cost of but if the cost of those go beyond what you can raise from tax and capital, and I mean the set of things at the risk of promoting my own stuff, if you go to my website, there's a simulator that lets you play with different capital taxes and see what you can get from it. Go to arun@advani.com. But particularly, like, if you go there, you'll see there's a lot of money that can be raised from fixing capital taxes. But once you've done those things, if you want more money, then I think it's worth remembering that there's a lot of income at the top 1%. There's also a lot of income still in the top 10. And we shouldn't think that just because the top 1% are very rich, that means the next lot of people wouldn't also need to pay more if we're going to try to fund a kind of overall much more supportive state that can do a lot more.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, and yeah, just on the politics of it, I do think even campaigning on 1%, it has the same problem, I think, where people don't quite understand where they are on the scale. I mean, you quoted that richest line research study in your book, which is basically these researchers in London did these focus groups where they tried to, yeah, oh, sorry. Well, you go for it. One of my favourites. So, but yeah, I mean, they basically, from speaking to people of different incomes and pitching sort of different levels of wealth, they worked out that people cannot draw a richest line. There is no line sort of where you're considered too rich, as opposed to a poverty line. You are below the poverty line. So I think even saying we're going to tax the 1% is not necessarily going to mean that everyone thinks, oh, that's fine because that's not me. I think it's more complicated.
Absolutely. Just to repeat Piketty's point, I also like, you can think about a new progressive reality where we're working with what needs to be done to mediate climate change, we're getting green jobs, everything's becoming more productive. or we can stay with what we've got, which is, I think Piketty calls devouring the past. Basically, Gary Stevenson is brilliant on this. If you haven't seen his video about wealth, you should go and see it. It's 13 minutes. Because basically what we have is, and it speaks to the point about the house as well. He says basically the wealthy are going after your mum's home because they've got all this investment income, but they're not using it productively to create in the economy. They're basically just buying up. So the value of land went up, what, 5 times since 1990 or something. So yeah, they're buying the homes that, you know, while we're fighting about inheritance tax, they've just bought your mum's home. So in terms of, there's no dynamism in the model that we've got. We're going backwards.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to keep in mind. Is that really what you want to vote for?
Well, I was going to move you on to Hartley's questions, perhaps, which was about whether there was internal consistency in the discourse of your interviewees.
Sure. It's a great question, actually, because obviously we're talking about 10% of the economically active population in the UK. That's around 30 million. So we're talking, we're talking about 3 million people. Obviously, it'll be very different in many ways, sociologically, where they live, etc. We didn't want to showcase this group as particularly cohesive. We just wanted to basically highlight that there were specific characteristics that were much more likely to be found in that particular decile than in other deciles. Nonetheless, there were like really interesting, perhaps some of the variables that where we found that that could be interesting to decile the group even further. Well, we have, first of all, the countries, obviously. I think there were quite a few interesting sort of differences in terms of the emphasis that you have in different countries. For example, one that really struck me is that in Ireland, apparently, they declare to face many more difficulties to make ends meet compared to the UK, even though they're, as I said, normally they have some of the highest wages in Europe. Or for instance, the case of Spain, I thought that was interesting culturally, that in Spain, they had a much more fatalistic view of poverty, and in the UK, it's much more related to education and aspiration, opportunities, that kind of thing. For example, another very important one, which we go on, which we develop further in the book, is the difference between Brahmins and merchants. Merchants were in a slight majority, but not necessarily an overwhelming one. And obviously, there's also massive differences between those that are closer to the top 10% threshold compared to the top 1% threshold. But one thing that they probably all shared was a certain sense of insecurity and a fear of falling. We actually struggled quite a lot with trying to have a sort of phrase that sort of encompasses that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm defending the title. And another question that she asked was whether there was room for optimism. In relation to that, I think that in the conclusion, it's not that we say that we should be optimistic. Actually, probably my first impulse is to be pessimistic about this. However, the argument that we make is basically that they're at a crossroads, and they're going to see that their position based on income is going to matter less and less, and increasingly less for the children. So one of the things they may try to do is to actually convert that into wealth. And that sort of defeats the very point that they're there because of meritocracy.
You are what you own, we should.
Yeah, basically. So there are crossroads.
Thank you. Okay, so back to the room. There's somebody in the back row there, please. Wait for the mic, thank you.
Hello, thank you very much for being here. My name is Bea. I am doing a master's degree here in philosophy and public policy. And I want to ask, considering the massive gender wealth gap in almost every European country, what do you think about the connection between gender inequalities and the political and economic situation of the top 10%?
Fantastic, thank you. And then there was one just here.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I wanted to, I couldn't help noticing that your characterization of the top 10% is that they are extraordinarily deluded in a sense, which is ironic considering what many of them, how many of them describe the bottom 50, for example, when it comes to issues like voting for Brexit or, you know, holding all sorts of socially conservative opinions. But at any rate, what I was wondering is what would you ascribe this sense of their attitudes against redistribution, the sort of self-deluded attitudes, the self-defeating attitudes in terms of how they think of policy and the kind of policies that they do support or oppose, which essentially perpetuate their own anxieties? Like, what is the cause of that rather than how do they justify it? Is it I'm just thinking, like, is it the extreme nature of the right-wing takeover of, you know, control of over-representation, shall we say, in the media? Is it the fact that, is it the composition of the top 10% in the UK, which perhaps is more financialized? Or is it something about, you know, many top 10%ers being obviously people who are in their 50s and 60s, who got to benefit from, you know, the free austerity policies, from having grown up in a society where maybe their thoughts on education, for example, made more sense, were more congruent with common experience, but are now irrelevant given the devastation wrought by the Tories.
Right. And one right at the front here, please.
Alex, I work in development finance. I have two questions about the top 9%. So what's the attitude towards taxing more top 1%? You mentioned this, I think I missed that. So my impression is that I don't think they just feel, they don't realize they're actually richer than they are. I think they're actually not that rich. Because if you look at your curve, so there isn't much difference. It's pretty smooth, it kind of becomes steep at the top. So structurally, there's a big difference between the top 1% and the rest. So I think there's a good reason why top 9% don't feel they're very rich. So in fact, that's why my question, do they see themselves as very different from the top 1%? Okay to tax them. Because one political tactics could be actually to draw them, to make them realize they're kind of working class and together with the rest. And in fact, yeah, rather than tell them you're rich, you should pay more taxes. My second question is about the attitude to what actually makes life more comfortable, more prosperous for everyone, which is various services here. You mentioned housing, property market is a big problem, so big expenses, so property, education, energy, water, and so on, transport. So in UK, NHS is very efficient. I think the rest, I work in energy sector, energy is very inefficient. So prices can be decreased a lot by not having this liberal policy. So this I'm sure, and I think in the others as well. So what's the attitude towards markets and state participate on the state in the economy? Is it very liberal, or they would be okay with kind of having more social democratic progressive policies in the sector?
Thank you. Okay, so I think I'm just going to come to Gerry and Marcos on this one, so that we can get one more round of online Q&A. If we have other questions, don't need to. Okay, so in which case I'll come to all of you in turns. Who'd like to start on the gender inequality, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, in relation to wealth, gender is a really important point. Actually, not in the book, but in the report in which the book is based, we have a graph on that, and it's pretty dramatic how the proportion of women declines with income, especially even within the top 10%. If I remember correctly, across the 4 countries that we looked at, I think there some that were a bit worse than others, but from what I recall, the top 10% had about a third of women, I think, in the UK, and the top 1 had about 17%, so around half. So yes, that's definitely part of it. I mean, there are many reasons behind that, but just wanted to move also to the last question, which was really good. In particular, in relation to a previous question that I didn't answer, I really wanted to, which was why target the top 10%? Because again, they might not feel particularly wealthy. And I agree with, I mean, to an extent, I agree with that. And the book is not necessarily about targeting the top 10% of income earners. If anything, it is to convince them to not necessarily be opposed to be taxed at the level that they are at the moment. In as much as, for instance, considering the first guy that was mentioning the question time episode, he didn't feel particularly rich, and as Arun mentioned that about a third of taxes from income we get from them. So it's really important for them to remain there, especially considering that, as we say, they're a politically important group because politicians are part of it by definition, because they include like the professionals and managers that govern our institutions, but also because they just simply vote more. You know, like income is absolutely correlated with how likely you are to vote, right? So not necessarily, it wasn't necessarily to want them to go in one direction or another, but basically to say that you are more similar to the 90% than to the 1%.
That's one of our key messages.
Yeah, that's one. Yeah, and in relation to the question of what are the causes, there are massive. You touch on some. I think age, which is something that we could have explored quite a bit more, which is a really important point. And the financialization of British economy as well. One thing that you made me think about as well, which is something that we mentioned, is that the less sort of trust there is in society, and I come from Chile, a society that is deeply mistrustful of the public sphere, the less likely you are to socialize with people with different income groups.
Yeah.
And the more inequality increases, the less likely you are to find yourself in circumstances where you're socialized with people who are different from you or very distant socioeconomically. And this is particularly important for the top 10% because they tend to put such an onus on education. So that means what educational establishment you and your children attend, and work, right?
Can I just add a few things?
No.
One key thing in Britain is that to move up, you have to move out. So a lot of our respondents use quite harsh descriptions of where they were born, where their local communities were, ghettos. You know, that's how they talk about their own hometowns. Or so there's the big, obviously, north-south divide, and the idea that you have to move. That's why we're talking about mobility. So yeah, there's a disconnect there basically, and they're very aware of it. And also the workplace, I would say, workplaces were described as quite hierarchical and not engendering any sense of connection. So they're and that the workplace perpetuates anxieties as well.
Anoosh, did you have anything from your research on the attitude of the 9% towards taxing the top 1%? I don't know if that was in the thing.
Yes.
No, we didn't, but there's a bit about that in the book, really. But I suppose it's the general truism where you say, yes, the rich should be taxed more, but the people who are richer than I am.
Yes,
Exactly. Some of these others.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I could add to that though. A couple of years ago, I ran the Wealth Tax Commission, and one of the things we did as part of the commission was look at attitudes to taxation of wealth. And one of the things I thought was really striking, most people are not going to pay the top, I mean, it's come down threshold which it starts, but most people are not going to pay the top rate of income tax. They also wouldn't have paid the kind of wealth taxes we were asking about. People were much more against high rates of income tax than were about high rates of wealth tax. They were up for there being a wealth tax. They were much less keen on raising the top rate of income tax because they felt like, I mean, then what came across in the discussion of it was that they felt like what income from work is something that people have kind of put in their effort for. They've done their bit for it, and that's sort of somehow deserved. Getting more money from wealth, having wealth, and just getting more wealth from that wealth, people felt different about. Of course, in one sense, wealth is a sense of stability and security, and that's one of the reasons that attitudes to wealth are, very complex, because people obviously will value themselves having that kind of security, and so that's why there's still kind of complicated discussions around taxing wealth. But people were overall pretty in favour of having something like a wealth tax. They were not very keen on increasing income tax, even though those are both things that most people in the survey were not very paying.
Yes, Gerry.
Sorry, no, it was just a point about attitudes to markets. I think choose a rude word. I think that our experience with energy has helped enlighten people, because we were very struck that nobody critiques the markets. I mean, obviously, are in the financial sector, a lot of people we're talking to, and there was just no critique of monopolies, of market failure, nothing. It was quite a big absence in their narratives. But that will obviously have changed since we interviewed them, because of what's happened with energy, and they're starting to become more aware. But it goes back to the common sense ideas, even to
Yeah.
the status quo.
Yes, and yeah, and commentably, there's also a common critique of the state as being inefficient. Absolutely.
Excellent.
Sorry,
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 yeah.
something that struck me on that point was a lot of your interviewees and lots of the sort of 1% people that I've spoken to just through work or in my life will say, oh, you know, we'll look at politics or Brexit or the mess that they're making and say, well, you could never get away with this in the private
Yes,
sector.
we had that a lot.
If this was my business, I would have been fired. Like there's so much narrative like that, and I think that's probably part of the common sense thing that you'll
Well, I'm about to get fired myself as chair. Wrap things up. But thank you, online audience, for your questions and participation. Thank you, audience in the room, for coming. Thank you to Maria, Emma, Peter for organising, and our stewards today. But most of all, thank you to our speakers, Anoosh, Arun, Marcus, and particularly Marcus and Gerry for writing the book. The book will be available for sale outside, just immediately outside the room here. It's a thoroughly good read. I really recommend it. Do pick up a copy on your way out, and also join us for a reception. Thank you very much.